Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love by Is This Self-Care? Narrated by S.E.P. Chapter 26. Mabon. Being irritating is a love language. As promised, the next day, Weasley flew to the manor to drop off the birthday gifts that had been sent to Granger's cottage. Granger had already popped off to her laboratory, so it was Draco who had the dubious privilege of receiving him. Weasley was not a dab hand at extension charms, which he demonstrated by arriving with a bulky burlap sack full of parcels, promptly heaved onto Draco's arms. Weasley panted. "Took me 10 minutes to pack up that lot." "Popular witch," said Draco, clutching at the ponderous thing. "Yeah." Weasley wiped sweaty hands onto his trousers and looked about. "Hermione said that she's handling it all right, staying here. Funny that this ended up being the safest place for her, after all these years." "I suppose. Thanks for doing this for her. You're really a decent bloke. Only a bit of a twat, after all." Draco had just opened his mouth to tell Weasley thanks and to piss off when Weasley added, "She likes you, you know." "Likes me?" "Genuinely," said Weasley. "Thinks you're enormously competent, eminently respectable, generally marvelous." He took on a high, Grangery voice. "Rather brilliant, you know, Ron. You mustn't tease him. Can't even refer to you as the ferret without being corrected." This had an immense cheering effect on Draco, but he kept his face neutral. "She does like to take up unfortunate causes. Yeah, she'll bung together a Society for the Protection of Eminently Respectable Malfoy soon. I reckon. Sperm. Suits you." So buoyed was Draco's mood that this insolence hardly rankled. He called Weasley a freckly fucker, but without rancor. "Has she launched a house elf rebellion yet?" asked Weasley. "No, but I expect her to start agitating eminently. It's only been 2 nights." "Yeah, she has loads of time to do damage." Weasley waggled his eyebrows as he looked about deviously for elves. "I'd better be off. You're on the lab later?" "It's Humphreys this morning, and Gogan to the PM. I'm with Potter at the safe house." Weasley tossed flue powder into the hearth. "Right, the traps. Make 'em evil and borderline illegal, won't you?" "Obviously." "Bye. Off you fuck." Weasley flew out. The bag in Draco's arms was heavy with expressions of love for Granger's friends and admirers. He felt the corners of books and the squishiness of clothing. Something cinnamony wafted through the burlap. He cast a few detection spells to ensure that there were no cursed or poisoned items within, and called Tupi to take the things to Granger's suite. He did not spend a single moment moodily musing upon a gift for Granger to outshine all of these offerings. The day passed in a series of visits to safe houses, where Draco and Potter hoped to lure any snooping baddies in with false indicators of Granger's presence. They created decoy Grangers, charmed to move about between various rooms, and set lights to turn on and off at night. They concealed a variety of wards and ensnarements around the properties. And yes, Draco's were crueler than Potter's. Potter had all the imagination of a horclump. When they had thus baited 5 safe houses along with Granger's cottage, they returned to the office to meet with Tonks, who had spoken to Shacklebolt. "Did he throw a full-on tanny?" asked Potter. Tonks shook her head. "No. It was quiet disappointment. He didn't threaten to sack me or Robards, so that was a positive." "Come off it," said Draco. "He'd never sack you for this." "The Greyback resurgence was a bit of a shock," grimaced Tonks. "He wasn't happy. Robards caught the worst of the bollocksing. He shouldn't have tried to keep things under wraps after the infant infector. Anyway, I've reassured him that Hermione is safe and will be continuing her work. He's asked to be kept apprised of the WTF's plans for the next full moon, and I'd like to participate in the next meeting, Potter, if you don't mind." A buzz in his pocket caused Draco's attention to drift. He glanced under the table to see a message from Granger. "Humphreys is very chatty," said Granger. "She is. A bit," said Draco. "Worse than you." "Everyone is worse than me. I am the best." "Have you been apprised of the ailments of her entire extended family?" said Granger. "And Gogan?" "Very nice man." "Good," said Draco, who did not grow jealous at all. "Loud breather," said Granger. "Man's broken his nose a few times." "Rather whistly on the exhale, isn't it?" "Ask him to toot you a tune." "He already is." "Which song?" There was a delay as Granger presumably paused to listen to Gogan. "Old Lang Syne, I think." "Festive," said Draco. 3 more hours of this. I may go mad. Miss you terribly. Will never be mean to you again." Draco's heart stopped beating at the sight of "miss you terribly." Then it resumed with disturbing vigor. Malfoy, would you kindly join us in the present? Came the voice of Tonks. Draco looked up to find Tonks and Potter looking at him. He grew aware of a vague smile on his face and replaced it with a scowl. Tonks opened her mouth to launch a barbed query about what was holding his attention so pleasantly, but Draco was spared further explanation by a knock on the door. Is Malfoy in here? Came the voice of Brimble, one of the junior Aurors. What is it? Asked Draco. I've got something to show you, if you've got a moment. Tonks shooed Draco away with a lively gesture, as though glad of an excuse to rid herself of the dreamy-eyed idiot. Miss you terribly. Why did that give him such a pleasant fluttery feeling? Kind of felt too nice to quash. Right, Brimble. Brimble was a young muggle-born witch who generally regarded Draco with a kind of fearful awe. Her specialty was surveillance and espionage. When Draco joined her at her desk, she nervously shuffled through a stack of papers and dropped her quill. Sorry for interrupting, she said. I thought it might be important. I've been monitoring Interpol's notices, and one of the persons of interest has just popped up. Which one? Gunnar Larson. Interpol has just linked him to a string of attacks. Your man is on some kind of an international rampage against researchers. They finally caught him on camera. She placed a stack of unmoving Muggle photographs into Draco's hands. Here, these were taken at a laboratory in the Netherlands. Larson strangled the lead scientist. Draco examined the sequence of photographs, which were blurry, black and white, and shot from a high angle that made it difficult to discern what was happening. In the first photos, Larson's large form hovered over the white-coated body. Then he held the scientist's head between his hands for several more frames, conducting legilimency, no doubt. The scientist appeared to raise an arm to defend himself, and then Larson's hands were at his throat. Is the scientist alive? Brimble rifled through more documents. Alive, but in critical condition. Hospitalized in Rotterdam. Who is he? He's, wait, I've got it somewhere. An oncologist. That's a kind of muggle healer who... I know what an oncologist is. Brimble looked at him with surprise. Right. Well, his name is Dr. Johann Dressen. Fuck. That had been one of Granger's co-speakers at the Oxford event. The Dutch National Police Corps is investigating, as are the Dutch Aurors. They've been informed that we also have an interest in Larson. I've reached out to a colleague in Japan and America about other attacks. From the reports I've seen, it sounds as though he's been performing legilimency on them and leaving them for dead. Draco took the file from Brimble. Well done. Tell me immediately if there's anything else. And I want to know if he comes into the country. Eyes on portkeys and international flus. Brimble nodded as Draco swept away. That evening, Granger was welcomed into the dining table by a stack of photographs and a retelling of Brimble's findings. She glanced as she learned of the string of attacks and gasped in horror at the photograph of Dr. Dreesen. Draco didn't want to say, I bloody told you so, but something of the thought was clearly in his expression, because Granger made a rare admission. You were right about Larson. It gave Draco no pleasure. Well, perhaps a little pleasure. I'm always right. It was a monumental burden, always being right, but he bore it with his usual grace. What the hell is Larson playing at? Asked Granger. What is wrong with him? I'd like to know, too. What is the arsehole looking for? Granger's brows were contracted into a worried line. If he's targeting researchers in my field, most of them are muggles. They'll be utterly incapable of defending themselves. Give me a list of likely targets. I'll inform their respective Auror HQs. All right. Granger stared at one of the photographs of Dreesen being throttled. She looked sick. Draco plucked it away and put it back in the file. It's not your fault. They sat in silence. Tupi materialized to serve dessert, which snapped them both out of their broody stupors. Granger took a long breath, as of one attempting to move on to the other matters, but with difficulty. Right, she said. We need to talk about Mabon. It's tomorrow, and we've got so many sites to visit. We need to be frightfully organized about it. As though Granger knew how to be any other sort of organized. Now it was her turn to plonk a pile of papers in front of Draco. She moved her chair closer, and her knee touched his thigh, which felt nice, and she ran through the itinerary with him. The wild, ancient names of the dolmens they'd be visiting rang off of her tongue. Bodawir, Henblaze, Tirmar, Pentar-Ifan, Hellstone, Goward, Anadorn. Draco suppressed a shiver. There was magic in those names. There were 12 in all. Granger's itinerary included flu points and apparition points, often a little way away from the sites themselves, as they were built on major key lines, too magically potent to apparate directly onto. Granger suggested that they use side-along apparition when not fluing, in order to stay together and avoid magical depletion through so many repeated apparitions across the UK. They bickered over who would apparate whom. Granger wanted Draco to pursue his magic for detecting and dueling if needed. Draco wanted her to save hers to defend herself, and perhaps reattach his limbs in the case of a firefight. They decided to compromise by alternating, which left neither of them satisfied and both of them glaring at each other as though they had never dealt with such a bloody-minded fool in their lives. Now Granger bit her lip. "We'll need to leave early tomorrow. I know you'll be thrilled." "I am positively effervescent with joy." "Brilliant." Frothing with it, Granger proposed the foul hour of 7 o'clock. "What? Bloody hell!" Granger's eye roll was magnificent. "Poor darling. It isn't that awful." "Vile is what it is." Draco sighed a dramatic sigh and sat limply in his chair. "I should have taken the troll porn." "The what?" asked Granger. "Nothing. Never mind. Eat your tart." "Eat your tart? I'd like nothing more." "Good." Draco ate the tart in front of him, but he'd rather have been eating the one beside him. Yet another wearisome irony in the difficult life of Draco Malfoy. Draco awoke at the monumental gruesome hour of 6 o'clock the next day to get ready. He bore the hardship with great fortitude, which he thought he ought to be praised for. He paid particular attention to his toilette that morning, desiring to achieve a certain look for the day's gallivanting. Dashing, yet elegant, adventurous, yet intrepid, but suave. His hair he arranged to look roguishly debonair. He wore his favorite boots, which he fancied gave him a swashbuckling kind of air. As he adjusted his hair in the mirror, Draco reflected that the prospect of spending an entire day with Granger, looking at mushrooms, should have provoked annoyance and true ennui. And yet, despite the hideous hour, Draco found himself rather looking forward to the excursion. At 6:55, satisfied with his look, Draco made his way to the entrance hall to find Granger. She was at the foot of the stairs, her hair in a high ponytail, her walking boots laced up tight, her eyes bright. Seeing her waiting for him, all kitted up in her walking things, was good. It gave Draco a pleasant sense of anticipation for adventure and argument, for treks through forests and accidental engagements, and fleeing mad nuns, all in good company. He had missed this. Draco downed 2 coffees and 4 eggs, and they were ready to crack on. Granger led the way to the flue parlor. She, too, looked to be anticipating this newest gallivant with pleasure. Her smile was warm. "Shall we carpe this DM?" "Let's." Granger threw the flue powder into the flames and spoke the name of their first waypoint. She stepped in closely, followed by Draco. And they were off. They fell into an enjoyable rhythm as they progressed through Granger's itinerary. At each stop, Draco's detection spell confirmed that they were alone, save for cows or sheep, and then Granger set to work, looking for the specific mushrooms and other plant matter that herbologist philosopher had decided to elaborate on, instead of something useful like bloody coordinates. The dolmens were large structures, still impressive despite their occasional collapsed states. Granger provided her usual historical commentary explaining that the monuments typically housed burial chambers and would have been covered entirely by a mound of earth thousands of years ago. They experienced every season imaginable as they progressed through Granger's list. Driving rain at Bodaware, glorious September sunshine at Taimar, thick fog at Henblaze. The landscapes were breathtaking. In the morning they discovered ancient woodlands and gnarled trees smelling of wild thyme, wide moorlands covered in millions of purple blossoms, and miles of rolling green turf disappearing into a hazy sky. In the afternoon it was endless fells covered in bracken, domesticated pasture lands, and cliffs plunging into the sea at the end of the world. Draco's favorite bit was the disapparitions, the moments when Granger threaded her arm in his and clung to him, and he felt the sweep of her magic over him, or cloaked her in his, and the spin of the disapparation knocked them into one another and pressed them together. He couldn't read whether she felt the same. She hopped cheerily to his side every time, but she was joyous in her element today, and doing everything cheerily. Her cheeks were quite pink, and then again, the wind was whipping over the Isle of Anglesey, and the air was frosty in County Down. But one thing was for certain, Granger was happy. Draco felt that there could never have been a happier fungi hunter hop-skipping about these ancient sites. There was a jubilance in her hope about her, fed by the knowledge that this was the penultimate step in her project. The end was in sight, and the world-changing would soon commence. Amongst the gorse and the autumn sweet air, the pack of lethal werewolves and the murderous Larson must have seemed far away to her. Problems for tomorrow's Granger, not today's. It gave him unaccountable pleasure to see her so happy. Now Granger approached him, shaking her head. Not here. Goward next. Direct apparition, my turn. Ready? Let's go. The spin, the squeeze, the warmth of her. Draco hoped for an awkward, slippery landing somewhere, so that she could conveniently fall on top of him. But alas, their landing places had been selected by Granger, and were therefore necessarily as level as one could ask for. The next dolmen was in a misty farmer's field, recently plowed. Draco's detection spells showed nothing but a smallish herd of deer where the field turned to forest. Granger quelched off, shin-deep in mud, towards the massive dolmen. Draco aimed a series of drying charms at 1 meter square patch of mud and stepped onto it to keep the worst of the muck off his boots. Then he alternated between keeping an eye on Granger and on the horizon. The herd of deer that Draco had detected drifted through the trees towards them. Their steps were soundless as they approached. Draco saw that their pelts were a golden white of Oysen deer, the magical cousins of the red deer, rare creatures that only existed in this part of Ireland. Draco had never seen a live one. The lead stag paused when it saw Draco, its magnificent antlers sweeping upwards and losing themselves amongst the branches. The stag's assessment must have culminated in a decision that Draco posed no threat. It lowered its head to a nose the ground, as did the hinds behind it. Draco cast a few detection spells to satisfy himself that these deer weren't baddies who had developed excruciatingly specific animagi for the purpose of attacking Granger. They were not. He wasn't paranoid, he was just careful. Maybe a little bit paranoid. Draco glanced towards Granger to see that she, too, had noticed their company. She stood stock still, a piece of parchment in one hand and her wand in the other. Sunshine began to pierce through the mist, turning the muddy field into a glittering expanse of dew bejeweled with golden wheat stubble and the shining pelts of the deer. The retrieving mist meant that the deer had lost their cover. They turned back towards the safety of the trees and, wraith-like, disappeared into the forest. One, a smallish deer, a younger hind, was trailing the herd, limping badly. "Oh!" came Granger's voice, which told Draco that she, too, had spotted the creature. "What's the matter with her?" Her voice startled the herd into flight. The injured hind was left to follow, limping as quickly as she could. "Suppose she's hurt," said Draco. "We need to help her." "Help her? It's a wild animal. Let nature take its course." Granger was, unsurprisingly, unwilling to follow this logical course of action. "I didn't see any blood. The way she was dangling the leg, I think it's just a dislocation. So she'll be fine." "No, she won't be able to put it back in herself. She'll die a slow and fear-filled death, or be killed by something horrid." To Draco's enormous irritation, Granger began to quelch toward the trees. "Granger," called Draco in a voice of great authority and menace. She took no notice, obviously. "Let's just stun her so I can have a look. They're terribly rare, almost hunted to extinction because of their pelts. We can't just let her die." "We absolutely can," said Draco. "Have you forgotten the beastly itinerary you've put together?" "Of course not. I built in extra time for contingencies." "And this is a contingency, is it?" "Yes. It's a bloody deer, of which there remain less than 300 living specimens. She'll die if we don't do something." Miney Granger, the most irritating witch of her age, continued into the forest. Draco swore and kicked an innocent mushroom, which had led a blameless life and did not deserve it. "I do not approve," said Draco, stamping into the wet forest after Granger. Granger was beginning to sound shirty. "I remember with vivid distinctions not having requested your approval. Haven't you any empathy?" "I am fresh out. Could you stop being such a bloody fucking do-gooder for one day in your life? Could you find a single ounce of compassion in that fermented porridge you call a soul?" "I have loads of compassion. For my boots." "Your boots," came the reply. "This is an act of kindness. It's a monstrous bother." And where was Granger's compassion for his hair and robes, if you please? Why were they wading into a bog? In the trees ahead, the golden hind glimmered. The poor creature was doing her best to get away, but her three-legged sprint had exhausted her, and Draco and Granger soon gained ground. Granger's stunners were flying in pursuit. "Stupefy! Stupefy!" "You would be so easy to lure into a trap," panted Draco, catching up. "Baddies just need to find a bunny with a hurt footsie." If you'd help me, this would be over faster. Fine. Stupefy. Draco's stunner hit the hind in the back, to absolutely no effect. Ooh, right, said Draco. Magic-absorbing pelts. Damn it, said Granger. I didn't think they'd be quite so potent. Granger changed tactics and transformed the muddy ground into a few meters of literal swamp, which half swallowed the hind until she was stuck. When they were about 3 meters away, Draco and Granger fired off an Immobilis and a sleeping charm, respectively, neither of which took effect, even at this close range. Incredible, said Granger, as though this was an intriguing scientific phenomenon and not a catastrophic death sentence for Draco's look. With strength borne by panic, the hind pulled herself out of the mud and plunged between the two of them, hoping to make her getaway between the lumbering humans. In a masterful display of athleticism and idiocy, Draco leapt toward her. He managed to grab one slender hoof. Then it slipped out of his grasp. He splashed into the swamp on his knees. It was in his hair. His hair! He was going to murder both of them. He would have venison for dinner and tart for dessert, and life would be simple again. Granger conjured a rope that snaked after the deer, but it was magically repelled the moment it touched her pelt. We just want to help you, called Granger. Stand still, you stupid bloody quadruped, shouted Draco, less kindly. The creature did not, judging by her extra burst of speed, speak English. Granger waved her wand and spoke an incantation, and a wall of earth surrounded the three of them. There, said Granger. No more running. The hind took her new surroundings into view. She was in a circular earthen pen. Draco leapt at her again, hoping to sweep her legs out from under her and lie her down to be examined. The hind dodged. Granger darted at her with her arms flung wide. The hind capered to the side. At this point, the creature seemed to conclude that they were absolute amateurs. She appeared to be making sport of their pursuit, dangling leg and all. She waited until Draco or Granger got near to her, and then dashed off again, churning muck into their faces. I am going to skin her myself and make a bloody cloak of her, snarled Draco through the mud. A swish of Granger's wand brought the earthen walls further inward. Soon there were only 2 or 3 square meters of space to step on, all of it swamp. They caught her. Draco laid the creature down and held her 3 good legs in a double-fisted grasp, as all attempts to conjure ropes or chains slid off. Her injured legs stuck out at an unnatural angle behind her. The hind gave out a heartbreaking bleat of fear and trembled, as though anticipating some horrid end at their hands. It's all right, shushed Granger. Somehow, muddied and disheveled, she managed to look perfectly angelic. We aren't going to hurt you. This mean man was joking. I'd sooner make a cloak of him. Draco had no coherent reply to offer, as he was spitting out mud. Granger felt about the deer's hind end, muttering about femurs. The deer kicked a free leg and coated Granger's hair into a liberal gob of mud. Granger closed her eyes and breathed. What are you doing? Asked Draco. Repenting? I hope so. It's fine, said Granger, throwing her sodden hair over her shoulder. She's afraid. It's not her fault. The creature did look pathetic. Draco's conscience, which was largely absent from his life, prickled at the sight of her fear-filled black eyes. He fell into an ill-considered lapse of kindness and stroked the hind's dainty head. Granger gave him a quick look of surprise before casting a diagnostic spell. It is a dislocation. Brilliant. We'll need to put her to sleep. She'll need to be completely relaxed. Then we'll do a bit of tug-of-war. At the sight of Granger's wand, the creature sighed, a look of absolute pathos on her face as she prepared for death. They poked about the deer until they found a patch of new skin uncovered by her magical pelt, a velvety smooth spot just under her chin. Granger stunned her. She consulted the diagnostic schema, and then, under her directions, they began the tug-of-war. Draco was instructed to lock his arms around the creature's pelvis and hold it as steady as he could. Granger wrestled with the leg, trying to find the magical angle where the head of the femur would slide back in over the ridge of the acetabulum. For a long minute, Granger tugged the leg, folded it, twisted it, pulled it, and then, finally, there was a soft click. Yes, said Granger. You did it? Think so. Granger flexed the hind's leg, which bent smoothly now and no longer lay at that unnatural angle. Granger cast another diagnostic spell. Perfect. Granger enervated the hind, who found her feet, trembling. She backed away from them, putting her weight evenly on all 4 legs. She was sound again. They lowered the earthen walls. The creature galloped off without a backwards glance, lavishing one final splash of filth at them in the lieu of a farewell. It went into Draco's mouth and up Granger's nose. "There's some bloody fucking gratitude," said Draco, spitting with every word. Granger sneezed. They looked at each other wide-eyed, mud-streaked, stinking abominably. "Your face! Your hair! They collapsed into hysterics and laughed until they couldn't breathe. Granger was still shaking with giggles as they apparated to the next site, the Devil's Den, and her high spirits endured because there, amongst long grasses under a soft blue sky, she found the magical combination of fungi and flora that she had been looking for. "Finally," said Granger. "Yes!" She kissed a mushroom. Mushrooms got more action than Draco. It was fine. And launched into a flurry of activity. She pulled mysterious paraphernalia out of her pockets and began to set something up between the dolmen's great stones. As for Draco, well, once lost, one's dignity is difficult to find again, but Draco did his utmost to recover his. He had to concede that his look was ruined. He cast Scourgify and Augmenti until he was, at the very least, no longer a walking poo. Then he cast a few Augmenti at Granger as she bustled about, just for sport, and also because she had kissed a mushroom instead of him. He stopped after her squeals got shrieky and she snarled, "Malfoy!" because he did not want her to turn him into an actual poo out of pique. "What are we collecting here?" said Draco, sauntering towards the instruments that Granger was setting out. "Light," said Granger, holding a kind of sextant up to the sky. "Light?" "Yes. Standard sanitatum requires exposure to sunlight in a churchyard. For the proto-sanitatum, we need autumnal equinox light collected at a tomb far more ancient, captured just as the sun passes the celestial equator. A shallow, mirrored bowl gleaming amongst the instruments. Runes were carved down its sides. Granger played with the sextant and a bronze compass and tilted the bowl further, so that it was aimed upwards, but towards the west. In her hand was a clicky tube thing. What's the clicky tube thing? A deluminator, said Granger. Ron lent it to me, bless him. Granger lay herself down on the ground next to the silver bowl and used the sextant again, making minute adjustments to the bowl's direction. Then she rose and clambered upon one of the dolmen's massive stones, and perched herself there. Now what? Asked Draco. Now we wait, said Granger. This year, the autumnal equinox takes place at 6:20 p.m. Oh, we've got loads of time. We do. We struck lucky, really, finding it on the 6th try. They had a picnic on the rock. Thick egg and cress sandwiches prepared by Henriette. The Devil's Den, said Draco, looking upwards at the massive capstone above them. What's so devilish about it? Local tradition has that a demon could be summoned here by pouring the water into these. Granger pointed at dish-shaped recesses in the rock. It would appear at midnight to have a drink. Only water? Nice sort of demon. I would have expected the blood of infants at the very least. Perhaps we can leave him some. Water, I mean. Not infant blood. I haven't any. When they finished their picnic, Granger rubbed at her face. In spite of Draco's sporadic efforts, she was still plastered with muck. Grime streaked across her cheeks like war paint. I think I prefer human medicine, she said with a bit of primness as she aimed Scourgify and Evanesco at herself. There's less chasing about of patients. It was fun, though. Fun. Oh, yes, I positively adore going arse over tit in swamps. Granger tutted, then leaned over to fix his collar. A bit of dirt makes you look dashing. Draco was nonplussed. Amusement made its way into Granger's face, and it was affectionate. Draco did not know what to do with it. But your hair. An absolute lost cause today, said Granger. Speak for your bloody self. They whiled away the rest of the evening with talk. They insulted each other a few times and snarled at each other a few times, but it was all right, because his insults made her laugh, and the warmth in her eyes softened the edges of hers. And they were arguing over, or were they flirting, really? As the equinox drew closer, Granger began to get fidgety. She leapt from the rock, checked the position of her silver bowl again, took out the deluminator, put the deluminator back, calibrated the bowls again, and began to pace. Sorry, she said when she noticed that Draco was watching her. I've practiced this so many times, but this is real. And if I bodge it, the entire project is set back by a year. But I won't bodge it. But if I did... You won't, said Draco. I won't. She flung up a spell to tell the time. 6:15 p.m. Granger knelt next to the silver bowl. The breeze danced among the long grasses. A charm of goldfinches took flight. 6:18 p.m. The smell of autumn drifted deliciously around the dolmen, heavy with fresh-cut hay. 6:19 p.m. The air grew thick with magic. 6:20 p.m. The equinox struck. The sun's rays hit the mirrored bowl, reflected upon themselves thousands upon thousands of luminous times, and formed a sphere of pure light. Granger, kneeling next to the bowl, clicked the deluminator. The ball of light was sucked into the instrument. The sun set. And just like that, it was done. Granger carefully slipped the deluminator into her pocket. Then she stood, tilted her head up, spread out her arms, and said, "Yes!" She spun in a circle, a small figure under a big sky, laughing her happiness into the heavens. Her spin swung her into Draco, and she turned the collision into an embrace, into which, on tiptoe, she pressed all of her joy and relief. He indulged. He held her just as tightly, his favorite old enemy, this brilliant do-gooder, this stupid crush. She looked up at him, and he looked down. Their cheeks met in a wet, muddy press, and then so did their lips. It was the most innocent, naive kiss that Draco had ever stumbled into. It dumped an entire liter of endorphins into his system. They broke away and gasped apologies to each other because obviously it had been an accident. They carried on as though nothing had happened, because he was her Auror, and she was his principal, and they were both consummate professionals. But something had happened. And Granger hadn't leapt away screaming, you know. She hadn't wiped her mouth, she hadn't spat, she had just felt warm, and breathed once, and now she blushed and busied herself with packing. Draco's brain reveled in the attainment of a new memory, of lips chapped by the wind and the taste of salt and earth. Granger assembled her instruments. "That's Mabon sorted," she said, relief in her voice. "I can hardly believe it." "A triumph," said Draco, and he meant it. "A small triumph. You're working towards a bloody big one." "Yes." The last of Mabon's sun caressed the top of the distant trees, exulted in a scarlet and gold blaze. Far above the trembling grasses and the rolling hills, the moon rose. Granger finished packing and fell onto her bum between the dolmen's colossal stones. She sat there for a long time, her hands in the earth behind her, her face to the sky, breathing relief. Then she caught his eye and smiled at him. The great wall of quashing was obliterated. Something vast and nameless swelled in his heart. This witch was... He hadn't the words for it, but he was struck by it. It wanted to engulf him. The sphere of light glowed still, but it wasn't in the deluminator. It was in him.